It's not possible to hide the harmful effects for very long. The main reason why the Japanese yen went up so sharply in price in 1977 and 1978 was because the Japanese government had been trying to prevent the yen from going up in price. In the process, what might have been small disturbances were allowed to accumulate into a major gap in trade. As a result, when market forces finally were permitted to operate, as sooner or later they must be, it took a major change in the yen exchange rate to bring things back into line. Why don't governments learn? Because governments never learn. Only people learn. And the people who learn today may not be the people in charge of economic policy tomorrow. As you contemplate this, you may come to agree with me that what we need are constitutional restraints on the power of government to interfere with free markets in foreign exchange, in foreign trade, in many other aspects of our lives.
Now, here in Chicago, the special guests who've been watching that film have their say.
This film has set me on edge. There is political, social, ethical considerations which do not reflect in the economic philosophy put out. There is a pervading feeling in this that the individual worker is to be totally sacrificed for the overall good of society. I don't see how possibly you can sacrifice individuals for overall good for society, because society is nothing but those millions and millions of individuals put together. And nowhere is there any consideration given to the social and the ethical aspects of the free trade formula that you advocate.
Let's get other views now around the group. What's your reaction, Don Rumsfeld, as a businessman, to the idea that Milton Friedman has advanced that America ought to buy in the cheapest markets, the cheapest goods, without protecting against them?
I swore I would never even try to defend Milton Friedman, and I won't. But let me comment first on Dick's comment. It bothers me to hear social and moral arguments invoked in an issue like this, because it seems to me the measure is what actually happens to human beings. Each individual ought to be concerned about humanity. For a single individual who's unemployed, that's 100% unemployment.
Absolutely.
And we recognize that. I recognize that. But the real world is, if you, as the film did, go to India, if you want to see things that one can describe as inhumane and poverty and problems of human beings, they exist. And the test ought to be what works, what in fact will provide a circumstance that will be more dynamic and more productive in the world.
It is true that in the long run we would all be better off with free trade. I agree with Milton. But it's the short run that matters. And in the short run there are serious adjustment problems. Now there's no question that the developing countries need access to markets such as American markets. And America needs them to export so that they can export more to developing countries. American exports to developing countries have moved from something like 20% of total exports to 30% over the last 10 years. But the adjustment is important, because what is happening at present is that it's not just a random group of workers that is affected by this trade. It's the most disadvantaged and underprivileged workers in America which are being affected. And they are by and large women and members of minorities in garments, in electronics. And I think that the adjustment consists of action on both the developing and the developed country sides. But let's take the American side. On the American side, the unions and industry, I think, have to get off discussion about moral issues and get their act in order.
I couldn't agree more with Helen. I think there is a very valid income distributional problem involved here. Certainly society gets better off. Consumers get better off as a result of cheaper imports, and I'm all for that, and there I agree completely with Milton. But if the incidence of the adjustment falls on disadvantaged groups, then you would want to do something about it. It really becomes an ethical issue. But the other point which I think Milton does bring up, which I disagree sharply with, is suppose if foreign governments do subsidize and actively promote exports to you, should you just sit back and just say, well, we're going to be better off as a result of this. I don't think that takes into account the fact that the whole international system can break down as a result of what people perceive in pluralistic economies as unfair competition emerging. And I think this is really what you're beginning to see. So we do need some sanctions. I mean, I may receive stolen property, and I'm better off. Of course I'm better off. But if as a result of this I encourage theft, I think few people would agree that that was something one didn't want to worry about.
Before I call in Milton Friedman on this, a reaction to the comments?
Yes, really to Don and to Helen. Don, you choose to set aside, or you appear to choose to set aside the social and the ethical considerations. And
not at all. What I said was you have to put the fact on a scale that there are social and ethical considerations with a free market or without one. And the tendency is for people to invoke morality only on their side and not to recognize that there are problems of human being in this world that are going to occur in each case, and the measure or the test ought to be what actually happens out there and address that question.
But you must also very much consider the social aspect of this situation. Helen's comment, the short-term displacement. I have a question for Milton at this point. How long do you put as a timetable on the displacement of these people, of these workers? 5 years, 10 years, a generation? How long will it be before overall society, balances itself out and the individual is no longer hurt?
Let me take your last question first and then go to your basic question. I have always been in favor of phasing out tariffs over a 5-year period, a 20% reduction a year for 5 years to give people time to adjust. Now to your fundamental issue. I thought I had heard every objection to my views imaginable, but you are the first one who has ever accused me of putting the interests of society as a whole ahead of the interests of individuals. If there is one element in my social philosophy, in my ethical philosophy that's predominant, it is that the ultimate unit is the human being, the individual, and that society is a means whereby we jointly achieve our objectives. I would argue that the social and moral issues are all on the side of free trade, that it is you and people like you who introduce protection, who are the ones who are violating fundamental social and moral issues. Tell me, what trade union represents the workers who are displaced because high tariffs reduce exports from this country? Because high tariffs make steel, for example, or other goods more expensive. As a result, those industries which use steel have to charge higher prices. They have fewer employees. The export industries that would grow up to balance the imports, tell me, what union represents them? What moral and ethical view do you have about their interests?
You still haven't answered my basic question. How long of a time period? How long of a frame? 5 years, 10 years, a generation?
I said 5 years.
And could we be clear, Milton, on this point? You're saying, though, that tariffs should be phased out over 5 years regardless of the action of other countries. It's not a sort of gap negotiation.
Regardless of the actions of other countries. So far, obviously, I would prefer to have other countries reduce their tariffs.
But if they don't move, America should move.
Absolutely.
You go along with that, Don Rumsfeld.
In other words, you're against reciprocal.
I'm not
you
against.
favor getting to truly reciprocal trade, but you're willing to get there unilaterally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me that it's probably worth moving in that direction. I don't know where I would stop. I am not...
Well, it's a 5-year program. Will you buy that?
Well, it seems to me that you get action-reaction. To the extent you're doing something that makes sense for human beings, presumably that would be persuasive with others. Presumably there would be a logical sequence where other countries would begin to sense that that had a certain degree of validity in the world.
Will that happen, Helen Hughes?
Providing you do something for the displaced workers in the country in which they're displaced. Because if you don't do something, if you don't take some action, and it's generally got to be government action, you will get such a backlash that you'll be back in the 30s with the sort of thing that happened with high unemployment.